Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have another exciting panel to talk with two fantastic founders, Dmitry Alperovich and Guy Pojarny, on a topic that I think is very, very important. It's called winning in a crowded cybersecurity market. Before we get started, let me start by introducing our panelists. But before I do that, in case this is the first panel you're joining today at FC Build, just a quick overview on Foundation. We're an early stage venture firm based in the Bay Area. We typically invest in enterprise and fintech companies, and we lead seed and Series A rounds. I'm one of the partners here, and I lead primarily our focus on cybersecurity and IT. So let me start by introducing Dmitry and Guy. Firstly, Dmitry is the co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike, a company focused on endpoint protection, threat intelligence, and attack remediation. Prior to co-founding CrowdStrike in 2011, Dmitry served as head of threat research at McAfee, Secure Computing, and CipherTrust. He left CrowdStrike in 2020 and is currently the co-founder and executive chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Guy is the co-founder and president of SNCC, a developer security platform focused on helping dev teams fix security vulnerabilities in their code, supply chain, and cloud infrastructure. He was previously the CTO of Akamai's web performance business and is one of the pioneers of the application security market. Thank you so much, Dmitry and Guy, for joining us today. Let's get started with the first question, and this is kind of rewinding the clock a little bit. Let's talk about your journey before you started these two fantastic companies. And before you did that, you both held senior roles leading technology and product at well-known incumbents in the IT and security sector, like McAfee, Akamai, and IBM. What were the key skills that you learned in those past roles? And were there any key learnings that helped you as you founded CrowdStrike and SNCC? And Dmitry, maybe if you want to start us off.
Sure, absolutely. So I've had a range of roles in my career, from startups to big companies, and McAfee was certainly a big company at the time that they had acquired Secure Computing, where I was an executive. And it was a really fascinating experience. Dave DeWalt was the CEO at the time, and then we ultimately sold the company to Intel, and I left shortly after that acquisition to start CrowdStrike. And I learned a lot of things of what you don't want to do in a big company as you grow to become a big company. The process of bureaucracy was stifling innovation, and the stop and go nature of hiring and looking at each quarter and not investing enough in building new solutions and responding to market needs was definitely not the things that you want to do as you're building a huge company. But there's also a lot of insights that you get of how to run a huge enterprise sales organization, how to run things at scale, how to think strategically about partnerships, and building a massive channel organization. So it was an invaluable experience that I think everyone should have a stint at a large company, because you learn a lot of good and bad that ultimately helps you in your career.
Yeah.
Guy, maybe if you want to add something.
Yeah, and I relate to that. There's definitely a lot of don't do this type elements, along with practices, some macro, some micro that you learn about it. I think you build an appreciation for some of the problems of scale, that when you kind of go off and you build something small, it's very natural to be very disruption minded, especially if you're founding a startup and you're thinking about figuring it out and just tailoring the right solution for it. But appreciation for simplicity as you talk about scale, and maybe the pains of inconsistency when you're operating at scale. So there's some learning of that. And then I think also maybe an appreciation of different people styles. I think you work at these big companies and you see who are the change agents, what are they doing, what are they trying to promote, how is that different? I think from a problem space perspective, or when you think about a market, for me, especially at the CTO role at Akamai, was very helpful in learning how to think about markets in big views, just sort of big market trends, being in a position to acquire companies and trying to define business cases and cast your eyes forward, looking at investments and those paths. It's also useful later for angel investments. And so I think thinking big, whether it's the scale and the operations or thinking about the market, was helpful. And then you have to reset and start small and build those. But you want to think about that destination. And so it was very valuable. It does resonate with me though, Dimitri's comment about like everybody needs to have a bit of a stint to it. Absolutely met some amazing founders that come straight out of university and build a company, and that can work. But I think some learnings around the realities of large companies, whether they are you're a customer later on, or whether you become a big company and you build those, where you're hiring people out of them, all of those are very hard to learn without experiencing. So I do think there's real value, at least periods of time at a company that's a bit bigger.
I think if I can just add one more thing. One of the things you learn if you do stint in a huge company, in most huge companies, is you learn why they don't pose a major threat to startups, because their ability to innovate in most cases is non-existent. And I see so many founders that get so concerned about what some enormous company is going to do or not do, and almost never should you really be concerned about that.
Yeah, and the whole hurry up and slow down when you're in a company, a startup, and someone approaches you with an interest, and in your mind they're about to buy you. So you're in a big company, you realize there's an element of getting others on board, and maybe even a person is entirely sold, but there's more to it. So be patient.
It's an excellent point. And I think I tell founders, particularly young founders, all the time that it is really, really important to have a little bit of that stint in a large company. For both of the reasons that both of you pointed out, the one being kind of you understand how it looks like to be at scale. And if you start a company, it's going to take a couple of years before you get there at best. And secondly, I think it gives you an indication for what the customer needs. Like you get to see all the pains. I think both of you described the issues of being at a big company. I mean, those are ultimately startup ideas. The most exciting founders face the problem themselves and decide to go and start a company to solve that problem. They don't see a solution in the market. So it is also an area where you get to go and create new ideas because you see the problems. Yeah, let's move things a little bit more into kind of this crowded security market. And both of you have been in very crowded subsegments of the security market. Dimitri, if we could start with you, the endpoint security market is massively competitive. I mean, there are over a dozen cybersecurity vendors. What do you think was the biggest competitive advantage for CrowdStrike? What made it stand above all of those other players and emerge as the leader?
It's a great question. And it actually dovetails into your last question, that one of the things I learned at McAfee is traveling 250,000 miles every year, meeting with lots and lots of customers. You learn about all the pain points that they had with McAfee and Symantec at the time, and Trend, about what worked and what didn't work. And it came down to two things. One was obviously efficacy. And we started CrowdStrike in 2011, and that was not by accident, because that was really the year when sort of the word APT came to some level of prominence with the hacks of Google at the time that I worked on and named Operation Aurora and Night Dragon and Shade Ground and all those cases back from 10 plus years ago. And people started to appreciate, oh my God, China and other nation states are actually hacking us. They're stealing our intellectual property. And the existing vendors just had no capacity to comprehend that and how to even deal with it. To them, the world was still all about malware and how do we stop malware from running on a machine, not how do you stop an intrusion, not how you stop an adversary that's getting in, whether they use malware or not. That was really the problem. And they weren't even focused on that problem. So that was one. And second one was seeing all the pains that customers had with just being able to deploy and manage endpoint security. I spent a lot of time with some of our government customers at McAfee, and DoD was the largest one. They literally had 60 on-prem management servers to deploy the McAfee agent across the entire DoD environment. Now, DoD environment is huge, 5 million endpoints, the largest one out there. But nevertheless, 60 servers, completely unwieldy, and they were SQL databases and reporting servers. It was just an entire mess, and they had to have huge teams just to manage that infrastructure, and it was never up to date and had all kinds of issues. And of course, at the time, SaaS was becoming a major thing. AWS, at the time was starting to get adoption. It was very clear to me that the next gen endpoint solution had to be very lightweight on the endpoint, not your 1 gigabyte agent that slows down everything on your machine and makes the booting experience feel like it's taking an hour for you to just open up your laptop. And if you offload most of that processing power to the cloud and you can manage it from the cloud, you can have a very delightful experience for the customer, both the people operating it as well as the ultimate end user, who really should not see the endpoint security agent on the machine. In fact, the first iterations of our product didn't even have a tray icon, didn't have any UI whatsoever on the machine, because part of the traction was you roll it out, the end users don't even have to know it's there. Now, in the end, we had to put some minimal UI in just to give users comfort that there was actually a security agent on their machine protecting them, ironically enough. But it was not sort of the heavyweight McAfee or Symantec bulky product that people just absolutely hated, literally hated. Like, I can't tell you how many customer meetings I've been at where people literally were almost willing to flog me and run me out of the building because I came from McAfee. And, it was very, very clear that the market was ripe for a change and a completely different model. And I'll tell you, it wasn't easy in the early days because this notion that you're going to do security from the cloud was heresy. People literally would tell us in the early meetings, particularly in the banking sector, some of these other kind of heavily conservative settings, that they will never use the cloud, that cloud is insecure, and how dare you as a security company even think about putting our data in the cloud? Are you nuts? And 5 years later, they all became customers. So it takes patience and perseverance, and it's important not to compromise on your objectives and goals. If you fundamentally believe that this is the future, stick with it, even if the going gets tough for a few years.
So I think it was very much the early belief in cloud that made CrowdStrike different. We'll talk a little bit about services in another question, but before we get to that, Guy, I think that what made Snyk different in the application security market was your early belief that developers needed to be involved in this conversation. And that was something that Qualys, Checkmarx, Veracode, Tenable, Rapid7, I mean, these are all great companies. Many of them were public in past years. None of them really thought about this at scale. You did. Tell us a little bit about how you made that decision. How did you think about the developer differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dimitri's comment about kind of being needing to convince some people kind of the possibility of it, but also having conviction around sort of the state in the future, I think is really the fundamentals. You have to get back to some first principles and anchor in that future state. At the best case, if you are successful, then you will start growing in 4 years and sort of 4 or 5 years, where you'll be there, and you want the thing that you optimized for to be stronger at that point versus less, and you want indeed that true conviction that when you get there, or that this is the direction that the world is going towards. And so for us, when it comes to security and building secure software, it seemed obvious, and it wasn't even that controversial that it was useful, that it was a good thing to embed security into development. I think the primary thing to battle was this notion that developers don't care about security, that you're never going to get developers to embrace security. And for me, it had to happen. It was really my view then and now is, Snyk or not, it's going to happen. The only way to keep up with security and securing your applications in a world in which you develop software continuously and you ship it multiple times is to do it within the process. So the question isn't if it's going to happen, is how is it going to happen? What is it that you need to do to make it happen, to get it done? And I think that sort of gives you a certain conviction. And I kind of very explicitly said that I would rather crash and burn than sort of pivot at that perspective. Like, that's what needs to happen. It does mean that from a core perspective, what we've done is we've building on that conviction, we modeled after the tools that the user consumes, not the buyer. And so for us, it was the developer. And so we built a company that is a developer tooling company. And so it looks and it kind of walks and talks and quacks like a dev tooling company. For a developer, it feels like another one of the tools that they are using, another one of the solutions, another one of the companies and communities that they engage with. And so once you kind of decide to do that, the playbooks were actually there. They weren't easy to execute. You have to do that well. You have to build towards it. But there were role models. But the role models were not necessarily the cyber companies of the world, definitely not the AppSec companies of the world, but rather the dev tools. At the time, it's like New Relic or Heroku, or you think about those. It did also mean that 2 years in, we were at, I think, 100,000 ARR. So there's a certain amount of perseverance, but also conviction. And we weren't the only company to come out saying we'll get developers to sort of embrace security. We were just, the only one that really actually persisted and pushed through at a place in which you go when you talk to the security person who signs the check, and they don't want, well, they might even say they want you to be dev first, but they at the time actually wanted you to behave. You're sort of infosec, and governance focused. So, but then if you persevere, and if you are right about your thesis of the market, and if you executed well in terms of building a great product and kind of listening to your customers and working with it, then at that point, that's when you have that head start. That's when you have, when the market turns, as it definitely has more recently. Then you get that momentum because you would have internalized and built an understanding, and of course a brand and a product and a user base that fits and satisfies the needs of that future.
It's a great point, and I think both of you hit on a very important point for the founders who are listening to us today, which is that you have to start with having a point of view, and that point of view may be developed from your prior experience, your prior careers. And experiencing the problem, but come up with a point of view that is different from what other people are thinking about, and then stick to that point of view. You may want to alter it a little bit, but once you have a point of view, don't completely pivot unless you absolutely have to. And I think, Dimitri, with your view, kind of in the early days of cloud, believing in cloud, and specifically focusing on that belief as you connected it to endpoint security, and Guy, in the early days of kind of this developer motion, product-led growth, believing that security should care about this area was really, really important. So, let's kind of stick to this topic that, Guy, you mentioned around, this developer-focused motion. Increasingly, now that has become the focus, particularly from a go-to-market perspective. And we are seeing this more and more, this question around, hey, should I be selling my product bottoms up or tops down? I think both of you have kind of experienced both sides of this coin. So maybe if I could start with you, Guy, what should a founder be thinking about as they're trying to make that decision in the cybersecurity sector? What are the things that they should look for to say this product can be sold bottoms up?
Yeah, so I think first of all you have to ask the if, right? Because product-led growth is sexy and appealing, and everybody wants to do it, but then people don't necessarily think it through. Fundamentally, it boils down to who is the user and who is the sort of the decision maker for your product. I think the notion of bottom up is a user focus. It's the question of who is it that is going to use your product on a daily basis, and at what is the minimum unit of value that you can provide that would actually sort of satisfy a need or a use case that user might have. If you're in a position of, like when you talk about compliance, for instance, that's a more challenging area to talk about small units because the premise of it is broad. Now, maybe you can still talk about sort of compliance in the context of an individual wanting to be compliant. But the bigger your unit, the minimum unit, the harder it is for you to do bottom up. And then so first you have to define that. You have to think about what is the minimum unit of value for which user, for which persona that you can provide. And then you need to think about friction. So you need to think about what is the effort required to get to that minimum value. If you need to give me admin access to all of your cloud accounts, that's pretty high friction. And so you have to think about, okay, what is the type of engagements or interactions that I should have with you, for that to be product led? Can I provide you with some concrete value to get you going without that level of trust? And it also delineates. So I think that sort of friction is an important bit. And so can you make the product? And it's not, is the product, is can you make the product easy enough to use to satisfy that minimum unit value? And then last and not least is you have to make you have to explore these two paths that are product led, which is a free trial and a freemium. And so if they're both product led, you have great companies that have been built, great PLG motions with both. But if that user that you have is broad enough, if there are enough people like that, and if the friction from a product perspective is low enough, then you have an opportunity to provide a freemium offering, and you provide that sort of narrow and get a very, very broad base. Because if you introduce the credit card, if you're in a place where introducing a credit card into the process will add a lot of friction, will kind of keep that person, that user from using it, then you build those out. If then that's and generally, like, freemium allows you broader reach if you have a great user, a big enough user base, a good enough value proposition, and low enough friction. If you don't, then you might, a free trial might still be a good model for you to work with, in which you're time binding it so you can kind of shower them with functionality and such. But you have to be conscious of it. What I see a lot of companies do is they offer a freemium product and in practice doesn't satisfy any use case in completion. So it's effectively a free trial, except they've crippled it and they just made it like a bad free trial. And so figuring those out. So I think those are, like, to me, the sort of the primary pillars in trying to figure out if you can do PLG. And security is tricky there, because security is an industry that naturally tends to bias for breadth. Like for us developer tools, that's a depth first. So all of these things are the default. You'd be hard pressed to find a successful dev tooling company that doesn't have a product led motion. But security tends to bias for breadth. And so especially in security, if you want to do PLG, you really have to ask yourself these kind of hard questions to see if it's right for you or not.
Dimitri, but I want to get your point of view, and we're starting to get questions come in. So it's the same question. I'll try to ask it. Nipun Gupta asked this in a little bit more controversial way. He said, do you think there's still a future for founders in 2021 who are creating security startups that sell to or build for the traditional enterprise buyer? So is this tops down motion gone?
So that's a great question. So I think in 2021, yes. In 2030, I'm not so sure. So, if you're thinking about staying in the business and not flipping your startup in the next few years, but trying to build something durable that lasts 10 plus years, I think there's a lot of risk that future will be very, very different in the coming 10 years. And I think there are a couple of major trends that are impacting that. One is I think we're going to undergo a massive shift in the role of the CISO. Mm-hmm. If you buy into Mark Andreessen's famous phrase that software is eating the world, as I certainly do, and every company is becoming surely a software development company, it's going to be more and more important to defend your platform, to defend your code, to defend your infrastructure where that platform is based, than it is to secure your email, secure your network, and what have you, website. You'll still do some of that, but it won't be the core focus of the company. It won't be where the crown jewels are. And you're going to have a lot of the power of the CISO, I believe, shift to the engineering, to the product side of the business, where they're going to be spending a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of time thinking about how to secure it. That's why I think Snyk is such a great company, because it is one of the few security companies that is tapping into that DevSecOps space that I think is just going to be absolutely massive. And kudos to Guy and the team for what they've built there. But I think the CISO is going to be a lot less powerful. They're still going to buy solutions. It's not, that role is not going to go away, but they're going to have less budget, less power. And there's definitely going to be more and more consolidation. I mean, this reality today where I don't even know how many startups we have in the security space, 6,000, maybe even more now, all chasing the same dollars and the same CISOs. I don't think that's tenable. And I think we're going to see some major losses on the part of venture capital firms that have invested in these companies at insane valuations.
Yeah, we'll talk about value. I have a question on valuations in the foundation. I have a question on valuations. I'd love to get your point of view, but before we get to that,
I'm just going to add one kind of quick comment on it, which is, I think in general, security follows decisions in tech, and in the platform. And thanks, Dimitri, for the sort of the kind words there of like, that's clearly a conviction in software. But I think in general, CIO kind of tech elements, I would say the era of a top-down technology decision is definitely, for a technical audience like sort of software development, is just not that's not the way the world is going. You can call it consumerization of IT, you can call it whatever you want, but fundamentally we're working towards empowered organizations that have teams that own more and control more of their path, and they're going to want to choose the tool. You can shove anything down their throats. You have to work with them, and so this bottom-up motion, I do think, will be stronger. It doesn't have to start at the developer. It can be at a slightly larger unit sometimes, but it can just be pushed from the top.
Yeah, it's a great, that last point, guys, is very critical. It does not have to be, when we say product-led growth, we don't mean just the developer. It could be the security analyst in the SOC. Like, don't go to the director of SOC operations, go to an individual analyst. That's one way to kind of go after that problem. Go to an incident response person, not the head of IR. Go to a threat research individual, not the head of threat research. I think it's a really important point, and sometimes founders get confused. The assumption is if it's bottoms up, it has to be sold to the developer. Guy, another question that came in from the chat, and by the way, for the audience, if you have questions for Dimitri and Guy, please put them in the comments. I'll try to fit them into this conversation. Mahendra asked this question around, well, what about open source? We're starting to hear open source security and open source projects being embedded into security companies. More and more companies are trying to figure out, should I launch an open source project around my broader company idea? How do you think about that? What's the advice you have for founders there?
Yeah, I think open source is another area that people kind of leap into without fully thinking what is it they're going to get out of it. So, I'm a fan of open source, and as a trend in general, I both am happy and anticipate that it will kind of, we'll see more and more technology and functionality being built as open source. To build an open source business, you have to ask, what is it that you want to get out of this being open source? It's like an extreme one-way door version of freemium. You're putting some functionality out there, and it is just freely available. And so you want to ask, what is it that you want to get out of it? If you want to try and get your project embedded into the Kubernetes ecosystem and be sort of a first-class tenant there, and then evolve from there, it has to be open source. Then yes, absolutely, it is very wise to sort of to build it around that open source core. But if you're just thinking you're going to get distribution because you open sourced it and people will just embrace it, it's probably not going to happen. The biggest thing that I think about, so that's sort of one element. And then the other thing that I would say is you think about use cases. So I keep pushing, every time I talk to someone, they talk about freemium and such. People so often think about technology capabilities when it comes to sort of freemium and open source specifically. I'll give this capability in free or in open source and this one in premium. That's not the way it works. What we want to think about is which use cases will be satisfied by the free tier or open source in this case, and which use cases do you want to be premium. And I think when you go open source, you just need to really, if it's a service, you have a bit more zigging and zagging capabilities, you have more visibility. So as a business, open source is almost always better. SaaS is almost always better. Like the software, the visibility, the control, the sort of the flexibility that you have is better. Sometimes as a business, it is still better to go open source. But if it's open source, you have to really ask yourself those use case questions early.
Yeah. Dimitri, anything to add there on open
no,
source?
I think Guy is absolutely correct. There are only a few open source projects that, have just massive amounts of use and huge number of contributors. And most of them, stick with one or two contributors and very little usage. So you really want to think about the value you get from that. It's not to say don't do it, but as Guy points out, it's a complex decision matrix that you have to go through, and you have to keep your objective in mind.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I'd also add just one more thing to what both of you said there, which is that the cost of actually building out an open source community is much higher than what founders think it to be. It's just really, really hard to get that adoption and get the number of contributors. And many times that's the reason why we see these open source projects come out of big companies like Netflix and Capital One. Like those are the large organizations where they're willing to spend lots and lots of dollars to get developers or non-developers, security analysts excited about a project. It's just very expensive.
And it takes years for that success. It doesn't happen overnight.
Correct. Yeah.
And so whenever founders are saying, "Hey, should I create some type of open source project around my idea?" I always remind them that it's not as simple as they think it to be, and maybe they'll get a higher valuation for this round, but that doesn't mean that they will stick with that valuation going forward. Yeah. Dimitri, sticking with you, we've talked about cloud, we've talked about this bottoms-up motion. What we haven't really yet talked about is services, and one of the key differentiators for CrowdStrike in the early days was you launched CrowdStrike Services early on in the life of the company, well before the software product CrowdStrike Falcon. Tell us a little bit about that decision, and do you think that more cyber startups should have a services business alongside their software product, and how should they make that decision today?
I think stepping away from sort of the business side of selling services, the concept that people are absolutely essential to doing security well, I believe just passionately and with all the fiber of my being. So you're not going to get away with people. AI is not magically going to solve security in any foreseeable future. You're going to need phenomenal people to solve the problem. And the reality is the vast majority of customers out there just don't have those people, will never have those people, will not be able to compete with the salaries and stock options that the top companies will be able to pay them. So they're going to need to hire a vendor that will provide them with a great service in addition to great technology. So that was always my belief, and that was one of the reasons why we did have actually a couple of services offerings, both a post-breach sort of response capability. You get hacked, so you call in sort of the SEAL Team 6 to fix the problem. And that was very strategic in the sense that you build a very close relationship with a customer. When there's a major breach, you're not dealing with the CISO, you're dealing with the CEO, you're dealing with the board of directors, and they're literally listening to all of your recommendations. So it's much easier to build, follow-on technology product sale post a breach. But you also learn tremendous amount about the failures that have occurred, what you need to fix on the technology side. So that feedback loop to the product is essential. But then we also had, we really invented this category of MDR, a managed detection and response category, because we believe that people needed help to hunt on their networks. Hunting is a very, very sophisticated skill. There are very few people that are able to do it well. Most companies cannot hire those people. And actually, even if they can hire those people, they can't keep them because hunters love sort of ability to investigate intrusions. And even in the most targeted company, you're not going to have an intrusion every day. So most of the time, these people are going to be twiddling their thumbs, looking for things that are, misconfigurations and not real attacks. And that's why they would go to a CrowdStrike or other MDR vendors where they can literally respond to a breach every hour, every 2 hours, and keep their skills fresh and their mind motivated. And, I fundamentally believe that providing services like that to help use a security product, a complicated security product, is going to make you more sticky. It's going to help you learn how the customer is using the product and help evolve it. So it's just an incredible opportunity that I think a lot of companies are missing out on by just deciding that they're going to sell widgets. In some cases, it's completely acceptable, but in many cases, particularly in this sort of traditional enterprise sale, you're selling to the CISO, I don't think it works well anymore.
Yeah.
Guy, how did you think about that? I mean, in AppSec, the need to find these vulnerabilities is very critical. How did you make that decision whether to have a team internally?
Yeah, so I think I think what Dimitri built there, and also the logic is very sound and very smart. There's kind of the best case and worst case, and then I'll relate to the snake. I think the best case is the case like CrowdStrike did, which is you use services to learn and therefore build a better product. So your services reduce the friction or the effort for a customer to adopt your product. But then subsequently, you're not building a dependency on it, but rather you're using that as a feedback loop to doing it. So it's almost like an implementation. So if it's not implementation, in this case, it's actual actions. I think it's a specific case in which there's a very human-centric type activity that is provided around it. But then you get to build and automate that. The worst case scenario is when your services become a crutch, when you ship kind of lame product because services can cover for it. And I've definitely seen that in my past. So that's the thing that really scares me. I think the more bottom-up path you build, the less opportunity you have to offer services. The product needs to sort of satisfy its own needs. And so we've definitely built enablement capabilities, but they were more around education and automation and sort of, handheld onboarding and things like that. Now that we deal with larger and larger organizations, we are looking into services that are more indeed back to the sort of the human and the culture element. DevSecOps, that's a transformation that cannot just be done with technology, just like DevOps has before. And a lot of customers are looking for us to support them and kind of help them implement and roll out, a successful DevSecOps program. And so that is interesting for us. It hasn't been a thing that we've sort of leaned into at strength. We're more offering these types of capabilities as part of our customer success activities and such, but it's definitely kind of an interesting path there. So I think services can be a powerful weapon. Just make sure that they enrich your product versus hinder it. And if that's the case, you need to act harshly. Like if you're sort of, if you find the product becomes a crutch, it can go down a very slippery slope.
It's an excellent point. Augment your product, your software product with services. Don't just rely on services to be another business unit alone.
Yeah, that can end badly.
Guy, sticking with you, one of the other ways that you win in these crowded markets is being close to where the talent is, where the investors are, and where the customers are. And when Snyk was founded in 2015, you were based in the UK. You're still there today. Your co-founders, Asaf and Danny, were based in Israel. Do you think that made it more difficult to build Snyk into what it is today? And how should founders be thinking about where to kind of be based in this market?
Yeah, I think there's some things that happen and some things, that like some were by design and some were just luck. And so, just sort of acknowledge there's some learnings right now of things that we've done right, even though we didn't do them right on purpose. So at the beginning, founding Snyk, the reason for the London and Tel Aviv was really based much more by background. I'm an Israeli and I was part of the cyber parts of the Israeli army. And I built, a network of great individuals, including my co-founders there, who I wanted to tap into. One investor even says, you're an Israeli, you're starting a cybersecurity company and you're not going to have a branch in Israel? That seems weird. And yet I was in London and I had a circle from the conference speaking and such events of people that I felt knew product UX, knew developer outreach, were thought leaders. And so I wanted to tap into both networks. Now, I was very afraid of creating an us versus them mentality. In a previous work, I moved from Israel to Canada, and I was moved from one team to another team. Both teams amazing. Both teams couldn't stand one another, and it was so scary. And so for me, it took a while to convince myself to say, okay, we'll do it. And the concession or sort of the full net was, fine, we're going to build this company in two paths. Fortunately found Danny and Asaf to sort of, join and build the company. So I knew, that the Israeli branch would be in great hands. But no team will be co-located. So we built the company such that although we were in two locations, all teams were split. Even if you're coming into the office, your team is not going to be all there. You're going to work virtually. Think of it as like a virtual first type view. We like the offices, and that has been a great decision. I think in hindsight, it wasn't as thought through maybe before, but we built that out, and that made the company be very remote friendly, very kind of scalable in our ability to tap into it. And I do think that in Europe, what we've also learned is every location has some concentration of talent of a certain type that pulls it in. It might be it's much easier to find front-end expertise and user experience caliber and talent in London than it is in Tel Aviv. It's much easier to find security talent, and sort of cyber talent in Tel Aviv than in London. We have this great branch coming out of the ETH University with program analysis, machine learning skill set. They're doing it, which is really quite unique, that area. And so we hire in all these places. We like our offices. They're kind of cultural centers. They're social centers. But being able to tap into these different ecosystems and build more mini offices, more presence, while the work remains virtual, all of these offices. And so the pandemic made no difference to us in terms of work throughput because people were working virtually anyway. they clearly had to deal with sort of the social impact. So I like that model. I don't think Europe, I think at this point there's an abundance of funding wherever you are. And when you get going, there's an abundance of talent. I think there still is a challenge around experienced talent. Like as we scale and as we bring new executives that have been there, done that on various fronts, that lags. Over time, I expect, like if you're founding a company now, in 5 years' time, situation will be much, much better. I like to say that London is to New York what New York is to the Valley in that respect. Like New York, it's like lags a few years back, but that does lag. So today, if I need someone who has scaled, whatever, an executive who has run a company through IPO, there are far fewer of those in Europe than there would be necessarily in the Valley. And we have expanded. We do have a great Boston presence, and we have great people on the West Coast. So the company has expanded a lot.
That's awesome. And Dimitri, you followed a very similar tactic. You just did it 4 or 5 years before Guy did. In the early days at CrowdStrike, you were fully distributed. You're still based in DC. Your co-founder George was based on the West Coast. There was no concept of an office.
No, there wasn't. And that was by design, and I had to fight hard for it because our investors, our initial board members, were obviously not familiar with that model. In fact, I think in 2011 we were one of the first ones to do it. At the time, Zoom wasn't even that popular. It took us a few years to discover Zoom, and I can tell you CrowdStrike probably would not have been successful if we hadn't found Zoom, because we literally tried everything under the sun, from Cisco WebEx and Skype and a gazillion other solutions that were all just absolutely horrible and not working. And thank God Zoom came along, and we were able to have a productive way to communicate with each team. But in many ways, just like Guy, I wanted to design teams that were completely distributed, that even if there was a concentration of people in one location, we would open up an office. We're not anti-office, by the way. The philosophy was, we're going to recruit the best people wherever they are, whatever country they're in, whatever state they're in. We don't care. We're going to grab those people. But we were very much focused that we didn't want one team to be co-located. And by the way, not just engineering teams, but I'm talking about finance, HR, marketing, whatever. Everything was distributed, and distributed by design. So you never had an us versus them culture. You never felt like you had to be in one location. And that paid off in strides when I was doing M&As, acquiring companies in Romania and Germany and Canada and elsewhere. And integrating those companies was a breeze, because on day one, they felt like they were part of everything, that they were not disconnected, that everything was on Zoom, everything was on Slack and virtual, and they could just learn and interact with everyone just like everyone else in the company. And that was really, really critical. Now, it doesn't remove the need to get people back together. So I like to say that even though a lot of companies that I'm on the board of have taken this opportunity during the pandemic to become virtual, it's not the best way to do it, because face-to-face interaction is absolutely essential. And we work really, really hard to bring individual teams together for offsites. In fact, we did cool offsites in great locations like Portugal or Hawaii, where people were looking forward to going to those places and would tack on vacation days and bring their spouses later on. So that is really, really important, and obviously is harder to do during the pandemic. But I fundamentally believe in distributed nature. I think if you're building a company today where you're focused on one geographic location, you're being foolish, because you're not availing yourself to the best resources that exist literally everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So we have 2 minutes left. I want to ask an important question. The one thing we didn't talk about is money. There's a lot of money in cyber right now, and both of you have raised tons of money, hundreds of millions of dollars at both CrowdStrike and Snyk. For context, before I ask this question about whether there's too much money, in the first half of 2021, there's 11.5 billion raised across 430 companies, and most of it was later stage money. That's more than the total amount raised annually for the last 8 years before 2020. There were 19 newly minted new unicorns in the first half of 2021, more than the last 4 years, the number of unicorns created in the last 4 years combined. So clearly there's a lot of money being spent.
I feel like the unicorn has become a misnomer, because it's no longer a unicorn. It's an everyday corn.
Exactly. It's no longer a unicorn.
At this point, probably, yeah.
Is there too much money? I'd love your thoughts both of you, is there too much money? Is it just going to be really hard to compete in our sector?
I do think so. We've talked a lot about this, Sid. Look, companies like CrowdStrike, companies like SNCC that have a massive TAM. I mean, SNCC, I think a guy who told me 28 million developers and growing that can potentially be customers. That is enormous opportunity. Obviously, you're executing on it, so you deserve the valuation you're getting. But a lot of companies I see, they're raising at insane valuations with no revenue, and the market opportunity isn't even that great. It's just not big enough. So you kind of scratch your head and you wonder what the hell are these investors thinking about. And right now they're thinking that the interest rates are low. It's easy to get credit. So there's a lot of M&A activity going on, and you can flip a company and get a great return in a few years. But interest rates are going to rise. We know that next year, and things are going to turn. And I think a lot of people are going to be holding the bag for these really unfortunate decisions that they're making. I think it's a huge problem in our industry, and there's going to be a lot of pain in the coming years.
Yeah,
Guy?
yeah. I think so I think like the total amount of money is maybe less the problem, because I do think the world is going digital, and you'd have big rounds. Companies are, well, now we kind of got back to IPO, but for a while kind of staying private longer. And I think fueling growth is an opportunity, because especially when you're product led, you're sometimes your ability to sort of hit the gas is greater, and a lot of great value gets created right away. But I fully agree that companies get funded at monster numbers well before they've demonstrated success. Companies get funded at like many billions before customers have had a chance to renew. Like, how do you know that this company is worth that many billions of dollars before you've seen a customer actually say, I like it enough to actually stick around and pay them again, before you've seen the model expand? And so I think the leap of faith that is being made on a bunch of these companies, I find to be excessive, and I agree that it kind of needs to come back to roost. I'm also starting to see unhealthy behavior. I think the worst case over there's the investor side, but also from a company's perspective is that companies paper over flaws and plans. They don't build the right muscles because they don't really have you need a certain amount of constraint to be able to figure out solutions. And so yeah, I think TAM is absolutely one aspect of it, and the other is just how much do you really know? What's the leap of faith you're making? And I think a lot of the investors, they rely on their preference and the fact that the downside is kind of capped. And for a lot of founders, that's just a mistake for the founder, because the founder is the one that will end up not getting, building actually a pretty nice and valuable thing, but when sold, the preference is just going to tuck them. They're stuck. They haven't really demonstrated they can achieve a multiple. They're just getting intoxicated in the numbers. And so there's an unhealthy, I do think it's those types of, there are many rounds that I look at and I says, that's just unhealthy, including, by the way, seed stage companies that I invest in that I think are great, and they're sort of raising sometimes at an amount where I don't follow on. And I also say look, it's great, and I love your company, but I think this is a bit too reach for what you built, and you should be mindful.
Yeah, it certainly feels like it's gambling, not investing. I'll tell you this: a lot of founders don't think about this. They want the highest valuation they can possibly get, but it may have a huge impact on your ability to hire if the options are priced at an enormous valuation for the new employees that are coming in post round. A lot of people are very smart these days. They're going to look at those strike prices and going to say, "There's not a lot of upside for me here, so why would I do this?"
Yeah.
It's a great point. We're out of time. I wish we could continue for another hour. I think we'd have enough to talk about. Even backstage, we had a bunch of topics. So I wish we could cover them, but we are out of time. The one thing I would just say that Guy and Dimitri, you both mentioned on this topic, ultimately, for founders who are listening to us, it is really your decision. And you have to factor in this point that both Guy and Dimitri are mentioning, which is that raising lots of money, if you can raise, does not mean that this is it. I think that's a great point. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Dimitri and Guy, for making time. This is a fantastic discussion. Yeah. And for those of you who are listening in, remember, once we end this session, you can still pick the next few panels that are starting at 11 a.m. Pacific. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sid. Thanks all.
Bye-bye.